You got it. Okay, we'll get started. Happy New Year, everybody. I'm Colonel Jeff Patton. I'm the Vice President of the Central Pennsylvania World War II Roundtable, and I want to welcome everybody to the program tonight, and thank everybody for your attendance and our online viewership as well. There's cold weather. It's been a holiday, and there's a football game going on right now. In case you didn't know that, and one team is winning. Just to let you know, one team is winning. I'm not going to give away the ending. As always, we'd like to start with the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you could please rise as you're able and face the flag to my right, and I'll lead in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. As always, we want to recognize our World War II veterans. I know we have two in the audience for sure, Mr. Irv Gares, Mr. Paul Schaefer. Anybody else? Raise your hand. And one more over here. Excuse me, we have three tonight. Thank you for being here. And again, we also want to recognize any other veterans. If you could raise your hand. Thank you for your service, and thank your families. Appreciate it. As always, fundraising is part of our program. So at the end of the program, we'll have original World War II helmets at the back of the room. And if you care or are willing to donate to our cause, you can drop some money in those helmets, and they'll go to our future programs. We call that the Helmet Committee. We also have mugs for sale. You'll see one of those at the end of the program. They're on sale outside by the books for $10, and then the donations for the books go to the program as well. So thanks for your support. As you may have seen in the slideshow, Grace United Methodist Church is undergoing some major renovations over the next few years and is seeking some support. While there's no fee for us to use these facilities, we do make an offering each month to pay for the expenses. If you are interested in donating directly to the Restoring Grace cause, you can use the green envelopes in the pews in front of you, and you can turn those envelopes into our team or the church office at any time over the next few months. It's a good reminder to thank the church for hosting us each month. So thanks to the church and their team for hosting us. We really appreciate that. So this day in U.S. history is quite symbolic, because in 1942, the Philippine capital of Manila was captured by Japanese forces. Very apropos for our program tonight. And some upcoming events, you can check out our Facebook page as always. But January 25th, there's a Battle of the Bulge conference at the American Experience World War II Museum in Gettysburg. You can sign up for that online. You can Google it. I know several of the people in the audience are already attending it. And I think there's supposed to be 12 World War II veterans at that conference. So should be a good show with a lot of great speakers. And it's a Saturday all day long from 8 to 5. Additionally, I've helped organize a World War II battlefield trip going from Amsterdam to Berlin, focused on Operation Market Garden. And it's leaving the last week of April and coming back in the first week of May for 12 days. So if anybody's interested in talking to me about that program or interested in going on that trip, come talk to me afterwards, and I'll give you some information or give you some additional details on that. Upcoming roundtable speakers, February 6th, a month from today, we're going to have Kevin Hiemel. He's the author of Patton's War, and he's going to talk about Patton at the Battle of the Bulge, his decision making. But if you have any questions on General Patton, he has all the information. He's an expert. And then March 6th, we have Colonel Ed Cottrell. He's a P-47 who flew P-47s over the Battle of the Bulge, ironically. He's 102 years old, so he's coming up from North Carolina, and he'll be here on March 6th. Two good programs coming up. And at this time, I'll introduce our speaker and start our program for this evening. So U.S. Army Colonel David Blackledge was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana in 1930. In 1941, David lived in the Philippines with his parents, where his father, William, was stationed as an Army officer, and his mother, Helen, taught school in Manila. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, enemy soldiers quickly overran the Philippines, like we just heard, on this historic day, and the entire Blackledge family was taken into captivity. His father was sent to a prisoner of war camp, and his mother and his youngest brother, Robert, spent the next several years in the Japanese internment camp, Los Baños. In February of 1945, they were finally rescued in a raid by a combination of U.S. paratroopers of the 11th Airborne Division and Filipino guerrillas. The family later learned that their father, William, did not survive the war. His father's sacrifice instilled in him patriotism, pride in his country, and a call to service. And Colonel Blackledge was commissioned in 1953 after graduating from Purdue University. During his 30 years of service, he commanded U.S. Army Field Artillery units up to the brigade level and retired as the Director of National Security Studies at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He currently resides in Carlisle and is accompanied tonight by his family, his son David, his son Alan, and his daughter Naomi in the front row. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel David Blackledge.
Well, I'm delighted to see such a good turnout. Thank goodness the weather cooperated, and I am particularly impressed with the fact that even though some exciting football games are on tonight, that you decided to come here. You can't switch channels here, and I will tell you now that I might go run a little bit overtime. So if you get through before I do, and you want to go home, my feelings will not be hurt. Having spent the 12 of my first 15 years in the Philippines, I want to welcome you with the traditional Philippine greeting and farewell of Mabuhay. Mabuhay, roughly translated, is may you live a long and healthy life. Good saying at the start of a new year. Okay, let's see what I got here on my slide right now. That is the message I want you to take home with you tonight. Unpreparedness for World War II in the Philippines, its effect on one American family. And the next slide, lest we forget. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And that's another message I hope you take with you tonight. Okay, who has been to the Philippines here? Oh, good, a few of you. I can tell you now, put it on your bucket list because it is a wonderful country. The people are so friendly, and you won't have a problem with the language because they all speak English, as you will find out why during my talk. Okay, let's start out by why did the United States get involved in the Philippines anyway? All right, it's 1898. Believe me, I'll get to 1900 before the speech is over. 1898. The United States and Spain get involved in a silly little war that should have been solved by diplomacy. And Admiral Dewey's, Commodore Dewey at the time, is out in the Pacific with the Asiatic fleet in a little town called Shifu near Nanking, China. The significance of that is it's one of the 19 peace treaties that were set up by the Western powers to enforce the trading that they did with China, which was a relatively weak country and had to go along with whatever they recommended. So all these countries have got their Asiatic fleets out there at this little Chinese port of Shifu, and Commodore Dewey gets a cable from Washington. We are now at war with Spain. Find the Spanish fleet around the Philippines somewhere and either capture it or destroy it. So off he sets to the Philippines. He's not quite sure where the Spanish fleet is, but his little fleet of submarine ships goes down past Subic Bay, which you'll hear about later, is one of the two prominent seaports in northern Luzon. And sure enough, they're not there, but he goes around. By this time it's dark. He slips in. It's like the cork in a bottle of Manila Bay, and the cork is Corregidor. He slips in the dark with his ships, all lights out, past Corregidor. Just as dawn arrives, he's in the middle of Manila Bay, and sure enough, as the dawn comes, he sees the Spanish fleet anchored off to one side in a town called Cavite. and he utters his famous words. At least every child when I was growing up before World War II knew the battle cry was, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." And Gridley possessed the fire. Gridley was the captain of the ship. He had one cabin, and the other cabin, of course, was the Commodore, who was in charge of the whole fleet. But Captain Gridley gives the order, they open fire. 2 hours later, all of the Spanish ships had either been destroyed or were sinking. And what were the total amount of casualties? The Spanish lost over 400 sailors killed. American casualties, 7 wounded by shrapnel. What was the difference? Not that the Spanish soldiers our sailors were not as well trained or brave as the Americans. It was all of their ships were outdated. Admiral Dewey's ship, the Olympia, was the latest thing that they had in the United States Navy. It had turreted guns, and the Spanish ships just weren't able to do any damage other than my shrapnel falling among some of the sailors on the outside of the turrets. So, this tremendous little victory, word is sent back to the Washington, and okay, the next day, and Admiral Dewey, by Commodore Dewey, by the way, does anybody know where he is from? Erie, Pennsylvania, and he's buried up there. His second in command was named George Lamberton. Lamberton. Where was Lamberton from? Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So the Spanish surrender what's left of their fleet. Lamberton goes ashore the next day, and he tells his crew, "If I'm not back in an hour, start firing again." The Spanish agree to surrender, and Lamberton goes on after the war to eventually become a admiral himself. Okay, so now we've captured the Philippines from Spain. What do we do with it? The Filipinos were receiving all the Americans with joy. Hooray, after 300 years of Spanish occupation, we're finally free. Thank you, Americans. Meanwhile, back in Washington, D.C., the big debate's going on. Well, what do we do with the Philippines? And a combination of imperialists and church clergy agreed that maybe we ought to keep them. We're going to go there. The clergy were all going to go over there. That's a Spanish country. We're going to take Protestantism to them. The imperialists said, we're the only big country in the world that doesn't have a colonial possession. And Manifest Destiny has brought us all from the East Coast to the West Coast, and it's time for us to become a colonizer. So the decision comes, we are going to stay there. Before the decision gets there, the German fleet had also been up at this little seaport of Seafood, and the German commander of his fleet gets a message from Berlin, find out what the Americans are doing in the Philippines and what do they intend to do. So he goes down with his fleet of 5 ships. All 5 of his ships are about the equivalent. They're newer than most of his ships. They're about the equivalent of the Olympia. He knows that Dewey is probably low on ammunition after the battle. He arrogantly sails in Manila Bay and proceeds to poke around with his ships. And Dewey keeps sending a message saying, "Who gave you permission to do this? What are you doing?" Finally, Dewey loses his temper. He sends a very undiplomatic message to the German admiral, which in fact said, "I am in charge here. If you want to start a war, bring it on." The German admiral is shocked. Can't believe this arrogant young upstart American is talking to him like that. But he gets the message, and he backs off and sails out. Now, what is happening right now, today, in the Philippines? China is threatening to seize all the nations in the China Sea. They are threatening the Filipino outposts in some of their islands, daring the United States to come to the help of the Filipinos and do anything. So stop and think about it right now. The Chinese have almost 600 warships. The United States has less than 400. Furthermore, the United States is having trouble replacing the experienced people who have been maintaining those ships. They're having trouble getting people to replace them, to learn how to maintain these ships, and we don't have as much naval power right now in the Pacific as China. So stop and think about it. What do you think the Chinese reaction would be if we call their bluff and try to stop them from harassing these Filipinos and their Coast Guard ships? Food for thought. So anyway, the United States has decided to keep the Philippines, and all of a sudden now, the Filipinos who for the last 20 years or so have been fighting guerrilla warfare against the Spanish, suddenly realize that the Americans are going to just take the place of the Spanish. And by the way, before I go any further, when I say Japanese, I will talk just like we did in World War II. We referred to them as Japs. I do not intend any slur. It's just that's the way I will just naturally talk about them during that era. The second thing is, I've had a couple of Filipinos in my audience, and they say, well, you mentioned our insurgent movement against the Japanese and before that, the Americans. You sometimes sound like you're calling us a bunch of monkeys. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't naturally say it the Spanish way, which is guerrilla. And so when I say guerrilla, I'm not making any ethnic slurs about the Filipinos. I respect them and admire them. Okay. And also the third thing I wanted to tell you is I've got 3 of my children sitting in front of you, and what I say is not necessarily what they would agree with. It's my opinion. Of course, none of you parents have ever had that problem. Okay, so the United States is going to stay there. The Filipino insurgents who have been fighting the Spanish are suddenly now fighting the Americans. American generals, well, we've got the firepower, and they start sending troops over there. They end up with 2 corps fighting against the Filipino insurgents. One of these corps is led by a General Arthur MacArthur. Ring a bell? Yep. The father of Douglas MacArthur. Arthur MacArthur won the Medal of Honor in the Civil War. His son gets the Medal of Honor in World War II, the only father and son combination in American history that both got the Medal of Honor. So Arthur MacArthur is heading one of these corps fighting the Filipino insurgents. One of the units he's got underneath him is the 10th Filipino Volunteers. And they went over, Filipino, 10th Pennsylvania Volunteers. And they sailed over there on a ship called the Philippines. My goodness, scratch that. A ship called the Pennsylvania. So that's a Philippine connection there. Arthur MacArthur's son is at West Point. He graduates in 1903. His first assignment as a second lieutenant is to the Philippines. His dad is coming back at the same time that the son is going over to the Philippines for his tour there. MacArthur sees that even though Arthur MacArthur has been winning every battle, he's not defeating the Philippine insurgency. About that time, the United States government sends a gentleman named Taft over to the Philippines to be its first American governor of the Philippines. Taft gets over there, and by the way, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the details because I have a handout there about President Taft, because he becomes the President of the United States. But he arrives over there, he sizes up the situation, he sees that what the military is doing is not winning the hearts and minds of the Filipinos, it's just turning them stronger than ever against us. So he decides that what we need is basically to get the Filipinos on our side rather than opposing us and try to do something to help them. Today we would call it nation building. He also realizes a problem. The Philippines has over 7,000 inhabited islands. Only about 8 or 10 of them are really big enough to be significant. But they're all divided into little areas with people speaking their own dialect there. Almost the size of a county here. Like Perry County couldn't speak to Cumberland County, for example, because they speak different dialects. So how is he going to unite these people? Well, the intelligent over there, the educated people, all spoke Spanish. Why not replace Spanish with English? So he sets up a school system throughout the Philippines where all the schools are going to conduct their classes in English. Now, we don't have all these people be able to speak English, so what do? We set up a program to bring American volunteer teachers over to the Philippines to help set up the school system and get it taught in English. So that is how my parents arrived over there. What slide are we at now? Okay. I've already told you about the two MacArthurs, and now the next slide, please. Here's my dad. That screen isn't showing up there, so I have to look up here to make sure. It's my dad in 1929 at the Indiana University School of Education. Boy, he was a hot shot on campus with that red flibber of his. Everybody on campus knew where he was. That's Bill Blackledge. And he had fallen in love with an attractive young lady from northern Indiana. He's in central Indiana. They were both going to become school teachers. In 1929, they graduate, ready to go out there and set the world on fire as educators. What happened in 1929? The Great Depression. Over half of the states in the United States decided it wasn't fair to have a husband and a wife both teaching in the school system, because it is a father's responsibility to support his family. If you've got the father doing this and the mother doing it too, she is taking away the livelihood of a potential male teacher. So they didn't allow both a husband and a wife to teach in the same school system. So what happened? My mother ends up teaching in a small school there where she grew up in northern Indiana. My father ends up teaching down in Orlando, Florida, of all places. Not much of a start for a marriage. Then they find out there's this American program. You can voluntarily go to the Philippines for 2 years and teach together. They don't care. And so great, this is wonderful. We can go over there and teach for 2 years and see if we like it, and meanwhile we'll be together. And that's how they ended up in the Philippines. They get over there. Oh, by the way, that 2-year contract you had, if you got fired or quit before the 2 years were up, you had to pay your way back. So that was an incentive to stay there, because otherwise you have to pay your own way back. Well, at the end of the 2 years, 1931 and 1933, not only were my parents willing to stay there, but my father was also promoted to principal of the Lingayen school system up in the area where the Japanese eventually invaded. So they were paid almost like Peace Corps wages, because first of all, they didn't have any problem getting volunteers. People couldn't get jobs in the United States, so they were glad to go anywhere they could get a salary. They didn't want them to be paid too much more than the local people, because it wouldn't look right for the wealthy Americanos to come in here while the rest of the people are living in poverty or subsistence level. So even though he was the principal and she was a teacher in the same school system, they had trouble getting to the end of the month with paying for everything. I was there. They had a child. Because of the poor medical conditions there, the child died. They finally decided in 1936 they'd try again, and another child was born in 1937, my little brother. They were having trouble economically. And by the way, she went down to Manila to have the baby so she could get decent medical care. They weren't making enough money that sometimes they had to worry about. They didn't have a refrigerator, they had an ice box. Once a week, a guy came by with delivery and put ice in there that was supposed to last a week. They were having trouble keeping the baby formula in that ice chest. They came home one afternoon expecting to find the milk soured. They opened their ice box, and there was ice in there. Where did this come from? The boy that they hired part-time to take care of the house, that was one of their students, said, I paid for it. He said, the baby needed milk, you needed ice. Another example of the way the Filipinos were there. See that silly piece of pink paper down there? That is to remind me to tell you about the first present I ever remember receiving in my life. Children's Day, one of my parents' high school students showed up, this young girl. She had made a kite for me out of bamboo and that paper. Two toys that the Filipino children grew up with. A kite, because they had the bamboo and they had the strings, and all they had to do was worry about getting the paper, and they had a kite. I love flying that little kite. The other one, a yo-yo. I couldn't find a yo-yo to bring tonight, but a kite, a yo-yo, you could almost guarantee almost every Filipino child grew up with one of those two presents. Okay, 1937, they've had this child. They were worried about finances. They were worried about not having adequate health care. So my father started looking around, found out he could get a job with the civil service down in Manila and actually get an increase in pay. Of course, the cost of living would be a little higher there, but they decided to make the move down there. So he was hired by the American-run Port Authority, which was nice because, among other things, when new ships would come in, he was expected to go out there and inspect the ship's papers and make sure they met all the immigration requirements, etc. And so he would take me out to those ships sometimes. Okay, I didn't ever show you a slide. I think the next slide I meant to show you my family in Manila. Before we moved. This is when he was a principal, and that was me in the center and my mother. So, in addition to the increase in pay there, they also started to have a more active social life. The only social life they had up in Lingayen was with missionaries. And so now they're down in Manila. They can afford a social life. And all of a sudden, my mother needs to have nice clothes. So if you notice, and I don't see where my pointer is, but anyway, on the left is a typical Filipino dress with the butterfly sleeves. If she was going to a Western dance or party, that's her formal on the right. It's 1937 was an exciting year in the Philippines. It was exciting to me. All of a sudden, I'm in the second grade. My mother had homeschooled me first grade. I had never been in a classroom with other kids before. The first day, I think I was under my desk most of the time, intimidated. And then after a day or two, I suddenly realized I could read better than any other kid in the class. And I got my self-confidence. I started making friends with it was a cosmopolitan school. We had Filipinos, we had Chinese, we had Western people of all kinds, all going to this school and all speaking English. And I remember the first time that I thought a girl was attractive was she was sitting in front of me in these row of seats, and her long black hair flowed down into my desk, and I used to annoy her, twisting and playing with her hair. The following year, I shifted my attention. The daughter of the Swedish ambassador was sitting in front of me. Beautiful blonde hair, blue eyes. Oh, boy, was she attractive. This is in the third or fourth grade. By the time I got to high school and I came back to the States, I was suddenly, oh, look at that attractive redhead. I ended up marrying in college the love of my life, a brunette. So I'm the full spectrum. We'll eventually get to what I'm supposed to be talking about tonight. Back to 1937. I remember going down to Dewey Boulevard, throngs of people lined up watching the bay, and then came the first Pan-American clipper. Landed in the bay, went up to its landing site. Passengers got off in the afternoon, passengers got on, and back and flew across the Pacific. That was the highlight of the year for me, seeing that take place. '37 was also a bad year because that was when the Japanese went on the warpath. They invaded China, and among other places, they seized where Nanking, when I mentioned earlier, being near the port of Shifu. And I was not that old that I understood, but I knew something called the rape of Nanking was going on. The Japanese killed over 100,000 Filipinos and raped, the first month alone, over 20,000 known verified cases of rape. All I knew was something bad had happened to women, and my father was a kind person and always taught me to be respectful to women, so I knew these Japanese really had to be bad people for whatever it was they were doing. By this time, the United States realized they were going to be on a collision course with the Japanese imperialists. As early as 1926, some of the prominent people in the government and in the military said, we're going to be at war with Japan in a few years. So the Philippines is getting to get a little concerned. First of all, they still wanted independence from the United States. So thank goodness. 1935, they sat down with us and we negotiated, all right, starting in 1936 will be a 10-year period where we will gradually prepare the Philippines to be independent. At the end of that 10 years, you will be independent. So that kind of, again, helped to bring the Filipinos on our side. I left out one other thing when I was talking about the Spanish-American War. Would you believe our Secretary of State publicly announced that our defeating the Spanish-American War was a splendid little war? Now, any veteran here who has seen the misery brought by war up close and personal knows there is no such thing as a splendid little war. There is a stupid little war, and it should have been solved diplomatically, not by killing over 10,000 Filipinos. By the way, the United States, in trying to put down the Philippine insurrection, lost more casualties and just trying to put this down in the Philippines than they did in the entire Spanish-American War, including Cuba, American casualties. So that's how expensive it was to try to quell the Philippine independence movement. All right, back to 1937. So, all right, we're going to be independent in 10 years. The Japanese are looking very threatening. What do we do? Well, General MacArthur, not the father, the son, Douglas MacArthur, is retiring as the head of the American Army. Why don't we hire him to come over here and organize for us? So that's what they did. So General MacArthur stepped down as being the top-ranking American general and over to the Philippines, and suddenly he's in charge of the Philippine Army. You know what his biggest problem was? Try and get the American Congress to support financially what he needed to do to get the Philippines ready for war. So gradually, slowly, little by little, we began to prepare the Philippines to defend itself. Okay, the next slide is already up there. Crigador was the first thing we needed to do to keep the Japanese fleet from coming in. So look at that beautiful 14-inch disappearing gun. What's a disappearing gun? It's down here, and you load it, it goes up over the parapet, fires, it goes back down so that the opposing side can't hit it with the return fire. What's wrong with that picture in 1940? It's vulnerable to air attack. So actually already practically obsolete when it was first installed there. Okay. What about ground troops? Oh, good. We'll organize the Philippine Scouts, mount them on horses, and we're ready to fight the war. All those, that's not a very good picture, but other than a few scout cars, those are all mounted on horses. And I'll jump ahead a little bit. They fought a tremendous delaying action against the Japanese when they invaded, coming down from Lingayen towards Manila. They were the troops that fought the Japanese and delayed long enough for the other troops from the southern Luzon area to get into Bataan to try to defend that area. And the importance of Bataan was whoever controlled Bataan and Crigador controlled the harbor. The Japanese couldn't get it until then. Okay, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So, okay, we got the Philippine Scouts, the 26th Regiment, and the Philippines are starting to get ready to be prepared to defend themselves. In 1940, I remember seeing them doing drill, close order drill with wooden rifles because they didn't have real rifles yet. By the way, in 1937, 38, 39, I could also walk down to the waterfront, and there were two rusting hulks out there of Spanish ships from 1898 sitting there in front of me, and I could wade out at low tide and climb up and walk around on them, which I did. 1941, they disappeared. What happened to them? A Japanese salvage company came in and bought them the scrap metal, took it back, probably converted it into artillery shells, and brought them back to the Philippines in 1942. So, what are we doing? We're trying to get the Filipinos ready to fight. Oh, wonderful! Instead of wooden rifles, the Filipino artillerymen were getting that beautiful little cannon that you see there, a 37 millimeter gun, the latest thing in artillery for the United States Army. And I remember seeing Life magazine pictures. This 37 millimeter cannon can fire anti-tank, anti-personnel, and anti-aircraft. All three, it's a triple-purpose weapon. One of those two shells down there is a projectile from that 37 millimeter cannon. When war broke out, it turned out to be totally worthless. That 37 millimeter projectile bounced off of even the Japanese light tanks. Now, one of those two down there is a 40 millimeter tank shell. I invite you afterwards to come up and, before you pick them up, tell which one is a 37 millimeter and which one is a 40 millimeters. Believe me, with your eyes closed, you'll know the difference. That's just 3 millimeters difference in diameter. As an artilleryman, I have to tell you, during World War II, our standard weapon was not the 37 or the 40 millimeter, it was the 105. Now it's the 155 millimeter shell. Okay, I'm going to not let you sleep tonight without knowing this. There was only one place in the United States, as of last year, where the 155 millimeter howitzer shell is produced, and that's in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Our standard weapon is a self-propelled 155, and the place that is built in is York, Pennsylvania. A few months ago, the United States revealed to Congress that right now we are shipping so many of our standard 155 shells to Israel and to Ukraine that if a major war broke out today, we would run out of artillery ammunition in 10 days. Sleep on that one tonight. 10 days. A major battle with either China, for example, Iran, Russia, you name it. 10 days. However, we did find a use for that little triple threat gun. We could use it as a lawn ornament. So if you will go to Carlisle, you will see in front of the VFW post 2 of those beautiful little toys. Thank you very much. 2 of those beautiful little toys sitting out decorating, thank you, that area. Okay. This next slide. I think I might slide out of order definitely because it jumps ahead to the prisoner of war camps in the Philippines. This is after the Japanese invaded and forced us down into Bataan. They had prisoner of war camps and internee camps set up all around the Philippines. So, here's my pointer. There's Lingayen Gulf, where the Japanese landed, and then we, on return, came back in 1945 to the same place. Here's Manila. Basically around here is where my prison camp was. This is important down here because this is Palawan, where they massacred the American POWs when they were afraid that they were going to be recaptured by the Americans and rescued. So this is the big island of Luzon. Down here, this is San Tomas in Manila. Los Baños internment camp is near that large inland lake. And all these other camps were later consolidated as the Japanese began to realize that they were losing the war and they wanted to keep the internees and the POWs in as few places as possible, fewer guards to guard them, less of a logistic problem. When the Japanese invaded, I went to school that morning. It was December 7th in Hawaii. It was already December 8th in the Philippines. Unknowns to me, of course, I'm talking about that 37-millimeter gun. There was a transport that had just left the West Coast, Hawaii, and was now a day out from Hawaii coming towards the Philippines. And aboard that ship was a young National Guard officer from Wyoming, Hank Burgess. And Hank Burgess was a lieutenant who had already graduated from Yale University, spent a semester abroad in Germany, saw what was happening in Germany with Hitler, and while he was now in law school, when his unit was called up, the law school advisor, well, you could get a deferment because you're in law school. He said, no, it's more important that we try to stop the aggression that the Axis powers are doing. And so he's on his ship going towards the Philippines. He had grown up as a rancher's son, loved horses, rode horses all the time, herding cattle, and he was looking forward to his assignment. He was going to join the 26th Regiment of Philippine Scouts and ride horses with them. Okay, the ship is turned around. The captain's in a panic. He's sure he's going to get torpedoed at any minute. He calls the officer in charge of the troops, and he says, do we have any weapons or armor aboard? He said, yeah, we got 37mm cannon down in the hold. Bring up a couple of them and we'll defend our ship. Now, how he was going to defend that ship with that gun's beyond me. But anyway, the army goes down there and they said, it's hopeless. There was so much cargo in the air on top of that thing that we can't dig those things out. Well, fortunately, they made it safely back, and Hank Burgess goes off, and the next time we hear about him, he's joining the newly formed 11th Airborne Division. But I'm getting a bit ahead of my story. The next slide is actually, we're going back to Chefoo, China again. We're kind of jumping around a bit. I already told you about the 17 different nations that all kept their fleets there. It was a wonderful place to go for R&R or shore leave, and all types of entertainment were available, you name it, including this club that played jazz music, live music, and had hostesses to entertain you. And I can tell you right now that none of the women in that picture are wives. They were hostesses. And there are at least 2 Annapolis graduates in that picture, where I will not identify who's who for obvious reasons. But boy, they look forward to going to Chefoo and spending a week or so there. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. I wanted to say, my mother initially, the last time I saw my father alive was Christmas Eve, 1941. My father said goodbye to us, and off he went to Bataan, the last time I ever saw him. Meanwhile, he had moved his family from the little, but basically townhouse we had been living in to the largest apartment building in Manila, which was 10 stories. That was high in those days. And we moved in on the 3rd floor with a couple Americans. She was an invalid. And this one little 2-bedroom apartment was this woman and her dog, my mother, her 2 sons, and our dog, all in this little apartment and 1 bathroom. And my father did that for 2 reasons. One, he wanted to protect us from bombing that was going on, and the first night that we were bombed I could hear 4 miles away in Nichols Field being bombed. It was so loud that I was sure when I got up in the morning I would look next door and find a house demolished and my best friend over there dead. I found out from him when he went this next morning, he thought the same thing about me. And the nearest bomb was 4 or 5 miles away, but that's how loud it sounded that night. So my father moves us over there. This couple agreed to take us in, thinking it was probably going to be short term. He also didn't want my mother to be alone when the Japanese came in, because who knew after the rape of Nanking what was going to happen. So sure enough, 2nd of January, Douglas MacArthur had declared Manila an open city so that the Japanese knew they didn't have to fight their way in and trying to protect the people there. The 2nd of January, in come the Japanese troops. They did look a bit like the comic book characters that had all little buck teeth with bulging glasses and idiots. And no, they were tough, and they had bayonets, and they meant business. And the Filipinos quickly found that out. The Japanese expected to come in and be welcomed as well, like Dewey's people did, you know. Hooray, we're finally being liberated from the Americans. The Japanese were talking about the greater co-prosperity sphere of Asia, and all of us are going to unite against the Western powers that have been oppressing us. What oppression? They put a sentry on every corner, except on the slum area. They didn't care, but the residential and the business area, a sentry on every corner. put out the word that the civilian population were expected to bow to that sentry when they walked by him. If not, you were going to get slapped. You're lucky if that was all that happened to you. A reign of terror began. The Filipinos, who are used to American Western customs, couldn't believe that these sentries, when they had to relieve themselves, they just do it. Didn't really watch. If they had to do a number two, squat down in the street, that corner, and do their business. And, in retrospect, it probably was better than forcing themselves in the house to use the bathroom. But they didn't care. They acted like, you Filipinos, it doesn't matter what we do to you or in front of you. I personally, my mother, by the way, for the first 6 months the Japanese were in Manila, there was no school because the Japanese insisted it will not be taught in English. You either teach it in your Filipino dialect or you teach it in Japanese. Filipino dialect. When the war broke out, we had 3 servants. We had a chauffeur who spoke Visayan. He was from the central Philippines. We had a cook who was Ilocano. She was from northern Luzon. And the third one spoke Korean, Visayan, Filipino, and Tagalog. They couldn't speak to each other in their own dialects. So the common language was American, English. My parents lived there all those years, and they never became fluent in any of those dialects because everybody spoke English. So when they come these Japanese, okay, you're not going to teach in English anymore, you're going to teach in Japanese. Where are they going to get the teachers? So for 6 months, the Filipinos held out and went, okay, we're not going to have school if that's the rules. And finally, after 6 months, the Japanese relented and said, we don't care what you teach it in. Okay, my mother supported us during that period. Oh, the man that owned the apartment we were living in turned himself in. The Japanese put out word, all 4 nationals will report to San Tomas University, which was the oldest university in the Philippines, established by the Spanish. All of those people will turn themselves in to San Tomas University, bringing 1 change of clothes and 3 days worth of food. Okay, they turned themselves in. The man that we were living with went there and pleaded with him. He said, my wife is an invalid. Can she stay in her apartment? Well, all right for now. They really weren't prepared to take care of all this influx of internees. So yeah, okay, she can stay there. Well, she also has a caretaker and her children. Oh, okay, they can stay there too. So we had permission to stay there. Japanese came in, moved to the top of the 10th floor of the penthouse and set up telescopes up there to observe and direct aviation resources against Corregidor and Bataan. I would go up there and talk with these soldiers, not really talking very well because they would let me know. You could look through the telescope if you want to and watch planes being attacking Corregidor, and they nice little kid. My mother was supporting herself during this period. She's a school teacher. Schools are closed. She had more people than she could take care of that wanted to have their children sent over there for a couple hours each day and tutored by my mother. She never had more than 2 students at a time because that apartment was just so small. Her problem was keeping her kids out of the way while she was teaching. So she encouraged me to take my dog and go out for a walk and do whatever I wanted for a couple hours till the classes were over and then come back. As a result, I saw things all over Manila that the normal person would not have known about. I personally saw 3 different, one was a man, and later on 2 children that were tied up to telephone poles for some flagrant violation of the Filipino rules, and they were left there to die. All 3 of them died. I later saw a 4th one die when I was in San Tomas, and he was caught throwing things over the fence, probably to his former employers. Tied up to a telephone pole at the front of the entrance to San Tomas University. 2 years later, he was dead. The second one is what I told about. It was the most tragic one. These are people on subsistence level. Anything they can use or sell, they're going to try to do it. They steal it. So these Filipino kids snuck into a place where the Japanese had stored some things, and Japanese realized that what was happening, ran out and managed to catch the youngest one of them, tied him up to a telephone pole. For everybody to see what happens to anybody that violates our rules. The next day, his older brother came and said, let me take my brother's place. Oh, yeah, they tied him up and both of them died. There's things that people don't realize happen. All right? My mother is beginning to worry about the society ladies, upper crust ladies in Manila had organized themselves. They were going to help not only the POWs, Americans, but also the Filipinos who had been captured on Bataan. So they took the survivors of Bataan Death March. I don't have to tell you about that. You already know about it. And they started organizing the Japanese. Okay, sure, fine. We don't care if you give food to these people as long as you don't do anything other than bring them food. The biggest problem was getting medicine to them. And my mother started working with the Sea Society ladies to get notes and medicine into my father, who was now in the POW camp in Cabanatuan. And she got a feeling that maybe she was being watched. My father had one of his students showed up the day after the war started, and my father said, "Whoa, Salvador, what are you doing here?" He said, "I have come with you to fight the Japs." And he had taken ROTC under my father up at the Pangasinan High School, and here he was, civilian, had come and he wants to go fight the Japs. So he had gone to Bataan with my father. When the time came that they were surrendering, my father told him, he said, "You're not military. Wear your farmer's clothing and sneak your way through and get out of here. And if you could get a chance to go back to Manila and tell my family I'm okay, do so." And Salvador did that. Surprised my mother when you didn't know. She opened the door one day, and here's this guy disguised as an egg vendor selling eggs from door to door. And she said, "Well, Salvador, what are you doing here?" He told her, he said, he said, "I watched from the jungle, and I saw your father being captured, and he's okay, or your husband, he's okay." And she said, "Well, what are you going to do now?" He said, "I'm going to go and join the guerrillas. We will fight the Japs." And he said, "I will come back occasionally to check on you." And she got to worrying about, if he comes back and the Japanese are watching us, they're going to catch him. So between that, financial worries, and worrying about the Japanese maybe know what I'm doing, she decided that she better turn herself in. So we hired a horse-drawn cart, and off we went that morning. She told the lady, "I'm sorry, I can no longer stay here." The owners of the apartment building were very helpful. They said, "We'll find a Filipino to take care of it. Don't worry about it." So off we went to. We went into a San Tomas internment camp. I couldn't believe how well organized they were. The Japanese had made no effort to feed them or to help them in any way when they first got there. That first 3 days, it was the Philippine Red Cross and these society ladies that organized the help and got them through that first period. The people who had servants before the war, those servants who themselves were living at poverty level, would come and throw food over the fence and clothes to them and things. That always said it would be the name and address of who it was to go to. And these people in the camp sorted it out between themselves. All these different nationalities, different religions, it didn't make any difference. And by the way, while I'm talking about it, I never saw any sign of prejudice. I didn't even know what prejudice was when I was going to school in the Philippines before the war. The first time that I can ever recall seeing an act of prejudice was my first semester back in American high school in 1945. I went to my first high school football game, and I saw an ugly racial incident. And what bothered me the most about it was that it didn't bother anybody else. You just watched this take place. And how can this possibly be? So anyway, getting back to my story, they had set up a school system in there. The two occupations that were most represented in that internment camp were the religious people, all of the missionaries, and the educators. All these, so we had no shortage of teachers. When my mother first went in there, she found out that everyone was expected to do, every adult was expected to do some sort of labor to contribute to the whole system. All the teaching jobs were taken. The only job that was still available to her was cutting up vegetables for the meals. So she did that. It was amazing. You didn't know from a person's background whether he had been a banker before the war, head of some company that's like Ford that sold cars, or missionary or what. All that mattered was that they contributed somehow to the common good. If you want to read a book about the internment camp experience, a book written by an American missionary in China called Shantung Compound, I've got a copy of it down there, it's available on Amazon. It is the most inspiring book that anyone has written about the internment camp experience. And some of the others are more complaining about little things that happen from day to day and things like that with people that kept diaries. One in particular annoyed me. This woman was at Baguio. That little internment camp up there only had 500 people in it. And she wrote that just got word that they're going to move us down to San Tomas and combine our prison camps into one. And we don't like it. First of all, the weather is much nicer up here, cool in the mountains. And second, San Tomas is full of the riffraff of Manila. Riffraff of Manila, like sailors whose ships had been sunk and all they had on were the clothes that they wore when they went into camp. People who perhaps were involved in the gambling industry or other little shady enterprises. And worst of all, she said, they include 2 white Russian women who were prostitutes in China before the war. Okay, I didn't read about this until years after the war. I got out my little book that gives you a list of the roster about all the internees, what country they represented. Not one Russian name there. And then it hit me. I knew who one of them was because she had a son who was a classmate of mine, sat next to me in camp in the 5th grade, 6th grade now, 6th grade. He and I became best friends. He and I both moved to Los Baños, where my mother taught him the rest of 6th grade. After the war, he came back to the United States, presumably with his mother, and had a long, successful career. We corresponded till the day he died about 5 years ago. He left children and grandchildren. I am so glad that that stupid remark in that book doesn't reflect in any way that anyone could tell who that young man was and who his mother was, because this so-called prostitute, I guess did we already go by that picture of the party in Shefu? Yeah, if you can go back to that picture of Shefu. None of those are wives in that picture. There are at least 2 Annapolis graduates here. That is a dinner party being held for a group of U.S. naval officers and their hostesses, escorts, in the fancy city club at Shefu. Okay, now let me give you the background. Why did those women get there? Their parents had fled the Reds in the Civil War between the communists and the white Russians in about 1920. So those 2 women that were labeled prostitutes by this person keeping her diary were at best early teenagers when their family fled for their lives into China. Okay? I would like to have had that young woman who made that nasty comment about it. She hadn't even met these 2 people yet. She makes this nasty comment judging them. What would she have done if she had been faced with the situations they faced? White women, indigent, trying to stay alive and make their way in China. A lot of those women ended up down at Shefu, meeting all these ships' crews, and they had one big goal. I can improve my lot if I can get one of these people to fall in love with me and marry me and make me respectable. So obviously, the 2 women who were in my camp had succeeded in that endeavor because they had American names and nothing to identify them as having been prostitutes in China. So my message from that is, judge not lest ye be judged, and let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Let us hope that nobody here ever have a daughter or relative that is faced with the same choices that those women had that were refugees from Russia. Okay, enough preaching for this audience tonight. There's a hole or something in this, I swear. Anyway, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, we're now going to go to my father's story. At first, they were, after the Bataan death march, they were pretty well left alone. My father was put in charge of a barracks full of POWs, and he took good care of them. He kept a roster of every one of them that died as to how they died. He actually kept 3 books, and one of the 3 books is down there now. It's so faded you can't read it, but he was keeping track of all these people and what they died of. And I didn't know about this. I also did not know that he was managing through the Red Cross ladies that were coming in with food and medicine. So he was smuggling notes out, first when we were living in the apartment, and then second once we were in camp. He was smuggling notes out to my mother. I did not know about any of these. My mother never showed me these, or my brother, until after the war. In fact, she didn't show them to me then. I found them after my mother died in her possessions. Now, she had kept those all this time, San Tomas, Los Baños, hidden somewhere. We were waiting to go back to the States, come back to the States, living with her mother. At no time did she ever let either my brother or myself know that she had this secret correspondence with my father. One of the ways that she coped with her stress when she came back at the end of the war was she refused to ever talk about anything that happened in World War II. As far as she was concerned, her life began when she came back to the United States and started reliving a normal life. One time, my brother and I, when she was 100 years old, we tried to sit her down and answer our questions. At first, she said she agreed she would talk. After the very first question, she kind of looked at us, and by the way, I never in my entire life ever saw my mother cry. Never saw her acting like she was feeling sorry for herself. But after the very first question, there was a long pause, and she looked at us and she said, I don't think people should be forced to talk about things they don't want to talk about. End of questions. So, I'm getting ahead of my story. We're talking about my father now. That picture, 1944, the Japanese now realizing they're losing the war. The formerly relatively nice commandants of the internment camps are replaced by representatives of the Kempeitai, the Japanese equivalent to the Gestapo in Germany. And things got suddenly very rough. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, even under this benign group, early on in 1942, 3 British citizens, young men, probably off of the ships that had been sunk, decided, well, I'm not going to sit out the war in this internment camp. I'm going to sneak out of here, find my way down through the little zone, and eventually out of the Philippines into Australia and fight the war. They got caught. They were all beheaded. I mean, this is standard procedure. Okay, as long as you obey our rules, but one violation and you're fair game. So this is now happening in 1944. The Gestapo, the Japanese Kempeitai, take over and start running the internment camps. And things got really rough in a hurry. Okay? They also started shipping. They were having a labor shortage in Japan. They were having a labor shortage in the mines that they were using in Korea and in North Manchuria. So their solution was, well, we got all this slave labor sitting around in internment camps, and we'll ship them out of there and send them to Japan, Korea, and Manchuria and put them to work. However, there's no use sending them up there if they're going to die, so we'll only take the able-bodied ones. So this represents a group such as my father would have been, strong enough to make the trip and worthwhile to send up there to do slave labor. If my father had just been a little sicker and not capable of going there, he would probably have survived and been rescued at Cabanatuan. Now, in 1944, there's the last entry in the diary that my father kept. And by the way, when he knew he was being shipped out of there, he took these diaries and buried them, and they were found later on after the camp was liberated. And that's how I got hold of them eventually. but he was just walking around minding his own business, and this one Japanese guard who was a sadist, he loved to walk around with a huge 4-foot-long club, sneak up behind a POW and haul off and whack him on the head. And that's what happened to my father. And one of the POWs who knew him and told my mother later, he said, Bill was never the same after that. He said, physically he looked all right, but he said mentally he was not there anymore. And he said, all I can remember is before that happened, he would talk about he wasn't going to do anything to bring any punishment or attention to himself, that all he wanted to do was do whatever it took to survive and get back to his family. So this guy who is still looking physically okay, but mentally not all there, that was December 14th, excuse me, he's down in Bilibid prison in Manila, and the next morning they march a group like that down and load them aboard a ship called the Oyoko Maru. So, but remember what these people look like. Can we skip the next slide, please? Okay, the Oyoko Maru was a nice little luxury coastal, but back to Japan, Korea type of ocean liner. It's now sitting in Manila Harbor. This group of physically fit POWs was marched down and put on that ship down in the holds. They were deliberately, this came out in the war crimes trials later, they were deliberately not given any food or water because they wanted to keep them docile. So they marched them out already hungry, already thirsty down there, and they put them down in the holds. After they had put them in the holds, they brought wounded Japanese soldiers who were being sent back to Japan, and, this is interesting, the families of pre-war Japanese who had been living in the Philippines. Wasn't going to be safe for them to stick around when the Americans came back and the Filipinos took charge. So they were being evacuated. So all the staterooms and above the holds full of Japanese wounded soldiers and Japanese families, women, including men, women, and children, being sent back to Japan. Some of the complaints were that, what's that noise down there in the ship? And there's the Japanese major who was in charge of the POWs. He said, well, I can't have those POWs making all that noise down there. So he shut the holds so they wouldn't bother the Japanese passengers up above. What happened in the tropics? The temperature in the holds that night rose to over 120 degrees. They had no food, they had no water. They were like that for 2 nights. They went berserk. They had people biting other other POWs to suck their blood. We had them licking the sides of the hold of the ship in there. It was bedlam. Okay, they finally sail out, and they start around, they get up to almost to Subic Bay, the other harbor I mentioned, and the American Hellcats find them. Strafe the ship, disable the rudder, and the ship is now helpless. They managed to ground it near the shore, about 300 or 400 yards out, and it stays there. They use whatever lifeboats are left that haven't been damaged to get the wounded soldiers and the Japanese families ashore, and they left those POWs again locked down in those holds for another night. Finally, the next day, they let them up, and then we got the next slide. You see up to the right there, that sort of a blur, that's the ship. Make that way to their shore, and a little to the lower, can you point to where the tennis courts are? There's two tennis courts. 2 tennis courts, and as they're told, they're warned before they're allowed to jump in the water to try to swim to shore, you will stay between this area and that area, and if you stray past that, you will be shot. And sure enough, they had set up machine guns on each side of the boundary, and any the POWs who inadvertently or otherwise went past that, they would shoot at them and kill them. So the ones that did make it to the shore were herded into this little area of 2 tennis courts with 1 water faucet for washing your balls or whatever. And I can't believe they even managed to get to that many aboard that survived the first ship onto those tennis courts. Okay. After 5 days, and by the way, one of the American doctors had to amputate a wounded Marine's shoulder. He had been hurt so badly by the strafing planes that he had to, without any anesthesia of any kind, surgically remove his arm. And he survived that. Okay, 5 days later, they trucked them up to Lingayen Gulf, the survivors. There were 2 ships up there, the Honora Maru and the Brazil Maru, sister ships. Smaller ships than the Honora Maru, and certainly not as fancy. They loaded them up. They did a kind of a bad job. They first filled the first ship with as many people as they could, and then they put them with the leftover. So the Honora Maru was more heavily loaded than the Brazil Maru. And off those 2 ships went for most of them Taiwan today. Okay, the second ship, this picture up there, the one that's kind of blurry shows a picture taken through the periscope of an American submarine trying to decide whether that small fry is worth wasting a torpedo on or not. And I don't think he knew there were POWs on the ships, because there was nothing to mark them or indicate that. For whatever reason, he decided not to fire that torpedo towards that ship, the Honora Maru, which my father was on. Conditions were still bad on the Honora Maru, but they were not as bad as they had been on the Orioka Maru. At least the holds were never battened down to the point where it was so hot that they went berserk. Okay, they get up to Taiwan now, foremost of them. They're in the harbor. The Hellcats from the American aircraft carriers find them again and make a direct hit on the hold of the Honora Maru, killing many of the POWs that are in there. I think my father was in the other hold. I don't know, because I've never found anybody that could remember his being on any one of the 3 ships. Okay, they took the survivors of that ship, put it on the 3rd ship, and off it goes. You can see the 2 ships side by side, the Honora Maru and Brazil Maru. The 3rd ship on the Brazil Maru, and it was just as bad, if not worse, than it was on the Orioka Maru, the first ship. First of all, these guys are wearing rags. In some cases, they actually started out wearing clothes, and when they died, the other POWs in the hold with them took off their clothes because they were freezing to death up there. The ship was so cold and outgoing, 120 degrees down in Manila. Now they're freezing up there against the hold, trying to keep warm together. And if anybody died, stripping off the clothing to wear themselves to try to keep warm. The Brazil Maru captain could care less about their condition. So he arrives finally in the town of Moji, Japan, a seaport, and they start offloading the POWs. The Japanese civilians were shocked. When they saw these guys unloaded, the condition they were in coming off that ship, they couldn't believe it. As a matter of fact, their treatment improved slightly in Japan because the people up there felt sorry for them. So, of those troops, let me give you the statistics. Okay, and by the way, that picture shows what my father would look like, because he was carried off the ship unconscious, and he died 2 days later, without ever recovering consciousness. If you go down to Norfolk, to the MacArthur Museum, they have a special program going on now through May about the treatment that the internees and the POWs received by the Japanese in World War II. It's well worth going to, and these pictures are from that exhibit. They even had a picture showing the crematorium that my father was put in. His ashes were burned, and we got them back, and he's now buried with his parents back in Indiana. But what a horrible ending for someone who had never harmed anyone in his life, respected women, loved his country, and was ready to fight for it. And that was the last 1941 to 1945, the last 4 years of misery. Is it any wonder I hate the Japanese at that time? Okay, look at the statistics. Statistics slide, please. The Japanese hell ships. The voyage begins on 13 December and ends on 30 January. 14 1,619 POWs were loaded on that ship in Manila. 1,187 were either killed or died en route. 161, including my father, died shortly after their arrival in Moji. So a total of 1,348 killed. 88% of those that started that voyage died as a result of the mistreatment on that voyage. So 223 survivors. Okay, now we're ready for the rest of my family's story. When the Japanese started bringing in all these people from the other internment camps, we were already overcrowded anyway, and suddenly they realized they had to build another camp somewhere. So they created one and a little agricultural branch extension of the University of Philippines at a little town called Los Baños. And the reason I want to tell you about this is because, first of all, the Japanese weren't going to build this camp. They called for 800 young men, volunteers from San Tomas, to go down there and build that camp. Our own engineers designed those buildings, and our own engineers built those buildings, barracks, using native material, thatched roofs, bamboo sides, and they designed it. Then they called for volunteers to go there, and my mother was one of the first to volunteer. Why? For 3 reasons. First of all, when we went into San Tomas, she and my 10-year-old brother were living in an annex building by themselves, very crowded conditions. You could hardly get between the cots, and when you put the mosquito nets up, you couldn't see anything except mosquito nets in that room. I was fortunate enough to be put in a education building classroom. In that little classroom, there were 3 rows of bunks, 3, and at the end by the window was a 9th cot. And I was in the cot nearest the door, probably the least desirable of all the locations. You could barely squeeze between the cots, and 3 of the other 9 in the building, in that room, were British citizens, and they couldn't believe what had happened. They had been raised on tales of British glory, and Singapore fell, and all of a sudden we're in this, and these Japanese have defeated all Nelson and all our great heroes and the British tradition. They had a harder time understanding what was going on than I did, but we became very good friends very quickly. They accepted me as I had just come in as a newcomer, and we had a great time, except that I didn't have to go to see my mother and brother to stand in line because we had meal cards. So if I didn't want to get together with my mother and my little brother, I just went over there, used my meal card, and I got my meal. So she felt she was kind of losing control over me, and we weren't a family. So the big incentive to going to Los Baños was we built the camp ourselves. They called for volunteers. When my mother volunteered, that meant she was going to get 3 spaces. Now, these barracks were, you went inside, there was a corridor the long way and a corridor the sideways. And there were, in each one of these corridors, there were 24 spaces. So my mother qualified for 3 spaces. And then when they sent the list to Los Baños, they built 3 spaces. So we had 3 spaces in there. My mother, my brother, and myself were in there. The next side over, there was a young man and his wife, 2 spaces. So that's the way it went. So that's a big incentive to do that. Second, she thought, I have been to Los Baños before the war. I know the people there. I know the area. I know that the Filipinos will help us in any way that they can. And it's going to be a lot easier than trying to survive in a city like Manila if there's going to be a battle here. Third was food. You want to be in a town that's been under siege like Manila, where thousands of people looking for food? No. If I go to Los Baños, I know that the Filipinos will help me if they can, and our chances of survival are better there than in an urban environment. So some of her friends said, what are you going down there for? Don't stay up here with us. Well, you know everybody. He said, no, I'm going to Los Baños. And sure enough, they trucked us down there, and we were really delighted to spend our first night together in one room. I won't talk about some of the other people there, but it was a nice, congenial group. And as I said, that Chinese American that I knew that his mother was in China. He was there too. Classes, again, my mother was teaching 6th grade, so we were taught by her. It was ideal. Okay, now let's get to 1945. The United States lands both north at Lingayen and their forces down south of Manila, and the two forces starting to approach. Okay, I haven't said anything about the 11th Airborne Division yet. The 11th Airborne Division was formed in North Carolina in 1944. General Swing, we got a picture, so good. General Swing, West Point graduate, class of 1915, classmate and a lifelong football teammate and friend Eisenhower. General Swing has been put in charge of this new organization being formed called the 11th Airborne Division. Everybody knows about the 101st, the 82nd in Europe. It's amazing how few people know about the 11th Airborne Division, who actually did more days of active, tough fighting than either one of those other two divisions. Okay, General Swing is forming his airborne division, and his troops are a rowdy bunch. The commanding general down there at what was Fort Bragg now, then is now Fort Liberty, calls this general in and says, I understand your troops are rampaging all around the countryside and raising hell around here. I want you to get them under control. General Swing says, well, there are no angels, General. It's amazing how many people believe that because the Angels slogan is the Angels, that the story of how they got that nickname was because when they finally jumped in the camp and rescued us, one of the nuns looked up and said, you look like angels coming down to us, which is probably a true story, but that's not where they got their nickname. They got their nickname before they ever left the United States. It was kind of a humorous nickname because they shipped out and got over to New Guinea, engaged in their first fighting there. Not only did they make a name for themselves in the skirmishes they got involved down in New Guinea, but they also became known as General Swing and his 40,000 Thieves, because all the other units quickly found out if there were any 11th Airborne troops near you, things were going to disappear. Most interesting that disappeared was General MacArthur's G2, General Willoughby. Now remember, General Willoughby is responsible for getting intelligence, everything about what the Japanese are doing and letting MacArthur know so he could counter it. General Willoughby had special ordered a refrigerator for himself. Imagine, down in steamy New Guinea, the luxury of having a refrigerator in your tent. Well, the refrigerator arrived, was offloaded off the ship, put on the dock with all the other stuff that was supposed to go to that unit. It disappeared. The logical suspect was the 11th Airborne Division. But the 11th Airborne Division was 8 miles away. Well, surely they didn't do it. General Willoughby was furious. He ordered the military police to search every ship in the harbor and try to find his damn refrigerator. They never found it. Okay, continue the story. The 11th Airborne Division ships out from New Guinea. They take part in the reinvasion of the Philippines. They land at Legazpi down south of where we were, and they start to drive up the coast towards Manila. Meanwhile, the U.S. military aircraft have returned. They're flying over our camp. We see them on their way to bomb Manila. We see them on their way back. We see dogfights up there between the Japanese Zeros. It was an exciting time, believe me. At the first sign of a plane overhead, the Japanese guards would all go and hide in their foxholes. As soon as they thought the planes were gone, they would get out and run around and slap any internee they saw for having stood out there and watched that dogfight. So I won't go into all the details, but there was this exciting time when we saw at least one Hellcat pilot flip over his plane as he was shot down and drop out and his chute open, and he landed on the side of a big hill. Let's see if I can show Mount McKilling up there. Could you do it? I don't see it.
Turn it over. Dad, you pointed at the wrong.
Oh, right. That does make a difference. Growing old is such fun. Oh, that works better. Okay. This is the main gate of the prison camp. Up here is high. There's a mountain range between us and the coast where the 11th Airborne was coming up. By the way, I was in this barracks right there, and headquarters is directly across from us. I want to point this out. This is a trench which was being dug. Anyway, there was a trench down there. The Japanese explanation was, okay, you Americans, you didn't design the order system here for the crowd, the large amount of internees here, because they suddenly brought in all these nuns and priests. And by the way, that new section which we built was we called the Vatican City, with all these Catholic nuns. And okay, there's not enough water now for the additional 500 people that came in, so we're going to build this trench and you're going to lay piping in there. Only problem, we didn't see any piping. Oh, that'll be brought in later. So I give my story. This Hellcat flips upside down, the pilot comes out, and the chute opens, and he floats down between Mount McKilling and the western exterior of a fence. And within easy shot of the sentries on the outpost on that side, there were two Filipino young men, probably a boy about 20 and a younger boy, with a horse plowing this field to plant. What happens? This pilot comes down and lands just a short distance away from them. They unhitch their horse, gallop over to him, get him up on the horse, and one runs holding him and the other one runs beside him, and they escape. I am amazed. Why didn't the Japanese soldiers and the sentries, why didn't they shoot? They could have shot all three of them. Now, stop and think about it. These are people of subsistence living, depending on the crop from that field to feed their family. They have now exposed themselves to the Japanese as helping an American escape. That means they can never come back and use that field again. That entire planting season is lost to them, and hopefully the Japanese will not find out where they live and come in to retaliate against their families. Now that, to me, really shows how the Filipinos felt about us versus the Japanese. Okay. I told you about the various dialects, and some of the areas as small as the county, they speak this dialect. Some of the areas over here, they speak another. There were 8 different guerrilla units within 10 miles of our camp that were all fighting against the Japanese and periodically getting into squabbles with each other. So, next, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself again. I've got General Swing moving up there, and the guerrillas are watching the camp. They report to General Swing as he's going up the side there that you better come over and help these internees at Los Baños because they're being mistreated and probably starving, and they may even be executed. General Swing gets orders from General MacArthur, put as one of your high priorities rescuing those internees. General Swing says, fine, sir, but right now my primary mission is fighting a battle for Manila, and I can't spare anybody right now. MacArthur says, fine, but as soon as you can, try to rescue them. They actually had a date set. A week before we were actually rescued, they were going to come and rescue us. Plans changed. Corps headquarters tells the general of division, no, put off that rescue of those internees because all the planes and paratroopers are needed to land on Corregidor and let the ships come in and start using it, just like the Japanese. That was a high priority for them. It was a high priority for the Americans. So they put off the rescue, the planned rescue of Los Baños by a week. The guerrillas were disappointed. They were actually ready to go. You know, let's fight the Japs, and we're going to get some support from the U.S. Army. Postponed for a week. What happens during that week? February 20th. The Japanese inform us that the little bit of food that we were already getting, we were on starvation diets from at least before December, the already little amount of food that we had was gone. All they had left was a few bags of unhusked rice, unhusked. And they distributed that to us and said, that's all, there's no more. We don't know when the next food is going to come. Fortunately, my mother, 4 times during the war, we got comfort kits, 3 from the American Red Cross, the 4th one from the British Red Cross. In those comfort kits, among other things, was powdered milk, corned beef, and cigarettes. How do they distribute these? Well, of course, every adult immediately, oh, I'm a smoker, because they knew that was good training material if they got one. So my mother received her declaration of, I think, of 4 times, 1 time, maybe 6 times another, cartons of cigarettes. By the way, the Japanese helped themselves a lot of those too before they distributed them. So she was smart enough to get her ration of cigarettes and kept them until everybody who was a chain smoker had smoked their cigarettes. And then she was ready to trade. Okay, you want a pack of cigarettes? I want that can of corned beef. So that's what helped us sustain us when we got to those last 3 days and there was no food. And by the way, all around camp you suddenly heard a grinding sound of people grinding one rock against the other. What were we doing? Husking that rice, because you couldn't cook it and eat it unless it was husked. And one doctor estimated, he said, you probably spent as much energy on that as you did food value you got out of it. But at least you got something to put in your stomach to ease a little bit of the hunger pangs. So this is what going on for 3 days. Planes were flying overhead. I remember the night of February 22nd, going to bed hungry after watching P-38s doing bombing runs on the Cherry Hills, which again is that map up there. Yeah, on Mount Myeondong, they had the Japanese up there, and the P-38, the twin-tailed planes were flying over and dropping bombs on them. And I remember sitting there watching that and thinking, the Americans are going to win the war, but I'm and my family are going to be gone. So we went to bed that night. Sometime during the night, like about 10 o'clock at night, our elected camp chairman in charge of the committee in charge of the camp silently had his representatives go out and tell each barracks, we had one person in charge of each barracks, elected by us, pass the word, there will be no roll call at 7:30 tomorrow morning. Stay in the barracks. Well, I'm getting a little ahead of the story too, because 3 days before, when we got this no more food, the committee met, and what are we going to do? 3 young men volunteered to escape out of camp, make their way through the Japanese lines to get to the nearest military, U.S. Army post, and tell them things are going from bad to worse, you've got to get there and rescue us. One of those young men was an engineer named Peter Miles. And Peter Miles is the one that drew the map. That we go back to that slide. That is Peter Miles did that, showing in detail where every Japanese sentry post was. It was verified by a woman professor from Los Baños who had talked there before the war, and she walked around the entire perimeter verifying that each one of those outposts was there, and she actually found one he missed. So the 11th Airborne Division had an accurate map. Each soldier in the paratrooper company that jumped in camp, each one of them had a copy of that the morning they jumped, so they knew where they were when they landed. Okay, so these 3 men crept out to the fence at night. They knew once they went out of there, first of all, they got to get out without getting shot. Once you get out of there, you can never come back. And I missed another story I should have told you. A few months before that, Lieutenant Konichi, who had first been at San Tomas and was now at Los Baños, was actually running his show. The commandant at Los Baños was a doddering old man, and probably in his 60s, almost as old as me. And his faculties were probably about the same as mine, because I never saw him when he wasn't wearing pajamas. And he spent most of his time putting around in his own little private garden, growing his own vegetables. The guy that was running the camp was this vicious Lieutenant Konichi. Things were so bad and so desperate that sometime in January, one of the family men crept out underneath the fence, and right outside the fence there was a little ravine. This is the northeast, I'm not going to try to point to it up there, but it was the northeast corner of the camp. Just outside the fence was a ravine, and he crept out between the double fence, crawling under it, went out and got some food for his family from Filipinos. He stayed out there too long, or it took too long. He was coming back in as dawn was coming up, and the Japanese sentry spotted him between the two fences, dragging this thing of food. The Japanese shot him, didn't kill him. Konichi arrives, our camp committee arrives there. They're keeping the wife of this man away. We don't want to see this, keeping her in her room. And our committee starts trying to negotiate with Konichi. See, he wasn't escaping, he was coming back in. He was trying to get food for his family. Didn't make a difference. Konichi said he will be shot, and he was on the spot, executed in front of us while watching him. Okay, going back again now to the rescue. So these three men get to the 11th Airborne Division with the help of the Filipinos and guerrillas who got them there. And General Swing had already done some preliminary planning. There were 4 men, General Swing and 3 members of his staff, keeping it a secret from everybody else in the 11th Airborne Division, their plan to rescue the internees. So the plan was, first of all, we're going to have a company of paratroopers drop on the camp itself, kill the guards with the help of the Filipino guerrillas. Second, how do we get those people out of there? Because there's 8,000 Japanese troops within an hour's march of there that can come and wipe them out. Also, they're 10 miles away up toward the American line. There is a river. The rest of the unit forces are going to have to fight their way across that river to get down there and link up with the paratroopers who are rescuing us. The third part of the plan was an amphibious tractor battalion was going to go on that lake, 8 miles down that lake. The Filipino guerrillas were going to set off smoke bombs to show them where to come in, and they were going to come in and into the camp, and take as many of the internees as they could, load them up and get them out of there and back to safety. We're 15 miles behind enemy lines back there. What about the rest of the internees? Okay, the plan was get those people lined up, take the women and children first, the weakest men, the stronger men, and whatever's left there, start marching them down to Los Baños, a little village 2 miles away on the shore, and marching up the coastline till they link up with the force coming down after they've fought their way across the river and coming down toward them. Very ambitious plan, very complicated. Lieutenant Ringler is chosen because his company B of the 511th, they're all taking severe casualties fighting the Battle of Manila. He has the largest number, a little over 100 troopers still alive in his company. So he's selected for the task. They attach a heavy machine gun company to them, platoon. So we end up a total of about 130 that are going to jump in the camp. They go out to Nichols Field, they're spending the night with their parachutes, ready to go the next morning. Lieutenant Ringler gives them a big pep. They don't know at that time what they're going to do. Lieutenant Ringler gives them a little pep talk and says, we're going to be fighting behind enemy lines. There's a good chance that we're going to get trapped back there, and who knows what's going to happen after that. If any man here isn't up to the task, step aside now. Now, every single one of them went. Not only that, and this you won't find in most of these books, 4 Filipinos had attached themselves to individual soldiers, and this was not uncommon, like the one that wanted to go fight the Japs with my dad, who was a student of his. 4 Filipinos had attached themselves, young men, to individual soldiers. Sir, I want to go with you. They went and got permission from Lieutenant Ringler. Yeah, we got parachutes. Why? Well, Oscar wants to go with me. The nickname they gave this one. What? He doesn't know anything about parachute. He wants to go with me. He's barefoot. It doesn't make any difference. He wants to go with me. Well, okay, we've got the parachutes, we've got the room, and 4 Filipinos who had no military training at all actually jumped with their buddies that they had made in the unit. Amazing. Well, one of them did have shoes because a paratrooper had been severely wounded or killed that day, and his buddy got the boots for him. So they sleep under the wings. Meanwhile, the airborne recon platoon is making its way with the guerrillas leader around the camp. Took them all night to get there, but okay, it's almost dawn. There were 4 different groups. They were supposed to, all 4 of the sides were supposed to be covered by these people sneaking into place close enough that they could kill the guards in the morning. The signal was, when you see the first parachute open, you open fire. 3 of them made it on time. One of the American scouts got so close to the sentry post on this one corner of the court. When the Japanese guard came out to urinate, he urinated on him. The guy didn't say, hey, stop that. So, it's now 6:45 in the morning. There is a water shortage in the camp because there wasn't enough piping, as I told you, for the additional nuns and people and missionaries that were brought into the camp. There was only one faucet open at that time in the morning, and it was out in the gardens. So my little brother and I, with our clay jugs, went out there, and by the time we got out there was already a line of about 20 internees standing up, waiting to get that water, because by noon the water would be shut off, and you wanted to make sure you got that water. We're standing in line, a shot rings out from the other side of the camp. Everybody stops. What's going on? The Japanese guards yelling to each other, hey, hey, in Japanese. What's going on? Nobody knew. One of the men in the line says, I don't know if he had the advance information or not, but he said, I don't know what's going on, but I think we all better get back to the barracks. So reluctantly, because I was about that time only about 3 away from the water, reluctantly, we all followed his advice. Good thing we did. Because just as I got to the outside entrance to our little 3-man space, we heard planes, heavy planes, not fighter planes. I looked up in the direction where I heard the sound, and here comes a beautiful sight of 9 C-47s, which is a civilian version of DC-3. 9 47s, 3 abreast, coming in low. Now again, depending on your books, I've read every, they're 400 feet, which would have been too low, it would have been safe. They're 800 feet. I have it directly from Colonel Ringler. 650 feet is what I told the pilots. So they came in at 700 feet, and at the last, they dropped down another 50 feet, and out they jumped. Now my son has got 100 parachute jumps, and he knows, with a T-10 parachute nose that we used in those days, you don't jump at 400 feet, 600 feet maybe, and even then, it's a placebo that you're wearing as a reserve chute, because you're not going to have time to, anything goes wrong, goes malfunctions, you're not going to have time to use that. But they were used to carrying a reserve chute, so they had it. Fortunately, all the chutes opened, and all of a sudden, you know what my first reaction was when I saw these bundles coming out of the plane? I yelled at my mother. We're all lying down. I said, they're dropping food to us. And I suddenly realized these packages of food had arms and legs. And about the time I said that, firing broke out all around the camp. Now, let me tell you just so you'll know, what was that shot that was fired? And again, some of the books have got it wrong. One of the units that was supposed to take the side nearest the ravine, the guide got lost in the dark. And so it is now, dawn is approaching, and they're hurrying, right? They're stealthily sneaking in. They're hurrying to try to get in position before 7 o'clock. It's 10 minutes till 7. One poor farmer's dog faithfully carries out his responsibility and runs out and starts barking and following these guys trying to sneak into position. So finally, in desperation, the paratrooper that did it told me the story himself. He said, I had to do it. He said, I shot the dog. So, shot the dog. That was the alert signal, but I don't know why the Japanese didn't react. What were the Japanese doing? They had a routine of getting out at 7 o'clock in the morning and doing calisthenics for 15 minutes before they held roll call at 7:30. I don't think they knew that we had canceled roll call. So they were out there without their weapons doing their exercises, and I'm amazed that they didn't do anything when they heard that shot. But, you know, it was not unusual to hear guerrilla activities around the distance. This was a little closer than usual. When the paratroopers started jumping, the Filipinos, and by the way that the guerrilla leader in charge of all of these 8 different units got them to all cooperate together was he said, right now, most of you got old rifles. He said, we are bringing in by submarine the American carbines, which are better suited for the small little Filipinos than the big Garand rifle. So we promised that one unit in particular was anti-American, the communist hawks, which we had to fight later. Oh, American carbines? Yeah, sure, we'll join the fight. We'll join together. And so the unifying factor for all these 8 guerrilla units that cooperated together was they're going to get American carbines to continue the fight against the Japanese. So when those paratroopers started dropping, they started shooting, and they wiped out every one of the guards. None of those, well, one post at the very front, there were 2 soldiers with a machine gun, and they held out. because nobody could creep close enough to throw a grenade or shoot them up close. So the paratroopers who landed in a small orchard field near the camp, main entrance, fought their way up there and had the firepower to finally kill those final 2 Japanese. Okay, what about the Japanese doing their calisthenics? Konichi, unfortunately, was one of them. He yelled to them to get down there and get through the fence in that ravine. So they crawled into that fence where he had that man killed, and they crept down that ravine and escaped. Just the one part of the plan that didn't work. So we're all lying down in our barracks. Shooting stops. What's going to happen next? Thump, 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 thump. Somebody is marching down the center corridor, the long way of our barracks. They're wearing shoes, obviously, because otherwise you wouldn't hear that thump, thump, thump. Are they American, or what are they? One woman was finally brave enough to open her little latch door and look out, and she yells, "They're Americans!" We all jump up and look out, and sure enough, 2 of the biggest soldiers, they're probably 5'10", but 2 of the biggest, toughest guys I ever saw were one carrying a machine gun, the other a tripod, marching through our barracks. "Oh, okay, fellas, here we go. We got a job to do, so get out of our way." They get down the end of our barracks, they set up that machine gun and look up towards looking at the high ground, waiting nervously to see if there are any Japs coming. I'm a kid, what do I do naturally? I run, flock up to him. "Hey, okay, kid, we gotta get out of here. We got a bit of job to do." The soldiers that I talked to afterwards said, "We couldn't understand." He said, "None of you internees showed any sense of urgency." He said, "You were walking around like zombies and staring at us, and we were telling you, get out of here. There's ammo." Well, at this time we heard the sound, but it sounded like tanks. It was the amphibious tractors that had come down the lake and swerved in and came that 2 miles. They're coming in through the main gate. He said, "There's amphibious tractors out there. You guys got to go out there and get on there." "No, don't take your breath." The camp carpenter, one of the most valuable people in camp, had the only set of complete carpentry tools. He wanted to go get his carpentry tools from the shop where they were. "No, you can't do that." The Mother Superior of the nuns, "I'm not leaving without our Bible." She went down to the chapel and she finally came out with this huge Bible, and one of the soldiers carried it before they get it out. The rest of us, okay, he wants to get in those Amtrak's. And my mother and my little brother and myself got there, and we were immediately directed into one of them. As soon as they were loaded up, off we went towards 2 miles towards the shore. Okay, back in the camp is still about a little over maybe 40% of the internees, plus the troops that had landed to help us. What are they going to do? General Swing, who had planned to be on the amphibious tractors, his driver got lost in the dark, and he got to the lake just in time to see the last amphibious tractor making its way out in the water. It was not going to come back. He is furious with his driver. His lieutenant with him, who was supposed to be guiding him, said he heard language from that general he had never heard from anybody. General Swing goes back to Nichols Field, jumps in a Piper Cub, we called them in those days, aviation spotter plane, and he gets up and he's flying over the camp looking down to see what's going on. And nobody getting on the road and starting to march up to link up with the group coming across the river. So he calls down, and by the way, the man put in charge of this rescue was Major Burgess. Remember when he was a lieutenant on his way to the Philippines just before? He had now been one of the thieves down in New Guinea. Now he's a major put in charge of this entire rescue operation. The lieutenant colonel in charge of the amphibious battalion, amphibious tractors, had specifically been told Major Burgess is in charge. So General Swing's calling down his radio, "Major Burgess, what's going on there? Why aren't those internees on the road?" "Well, sir, we're trying to get them over." Lieutenant Ringley comes to the bright idea. He looks at Major Burgess, he says, "We can't get those internees to any sense of urgency getting out of the barracks. Why don't we burn them?" "Good idea." So they started burning all the barracks. That got the remaining people who were still trying to get stuff to take out with them. Got them loaded up. The Amtrak's gone up. Get the rest of them on the road. So the rest of them were on the road. Among those that were on the first group going out were 2 babies. One had been born 10 days before and one 3 days before. That must have been conceived before the rations dropped. But anyway, the nurses, there were 9 Navy nurses. Originally, they were with the Army nurses at San Tomas. When the new camp was formed, the Navy nurses said, why don't we go down there and we take care of that and leave you Army nurses up here? The Navy nurses thought that was a great idea. The two commanders of the two units had gotten along fine, but it was nice to have just the Army nurses up at San Tomas, the Navy nurses. But 5,000 up in San Tomas with 70 Army nurses, over 2,000 of us with just 9 nurses down at Los Baños. The Navy nurses, all of them were overworked. But those Navy nurses in particular are my heroes. Do you know that 2 of those 9 nurses personally saved those babies from starving to death? I didn't know until just recently. The one that was born 3 days before, the mother was dying of malnutrition and having a baby. So they decided, they induced the baby because we'll try to at least save one of them. If we can't save one, we'll try to save 2. And so those 2 nurses, personally, the mother, almost unconscious on a stretcher, was put in one amphibious tractor. The other nurse with that little 3-day-old baby, Lois, by the way, one of the books got the name on, I don't know why, on the other amphibious tractor. I have spoken to the man manning that machine gun on that amphibious tractor. When the Japanese up on that mountain, Mayon Point, started shooting at us as we were going across the lake, he was afraid that little 3-day-old baby was going to get hit by a shell. He takes off his helmet, uses it as a cradle to hold and protect that little baby. Well, meanwhile, the almost unconscious mother is probably wondering in the other amphibious tractor what's happened to my son, my daughter. So anyway, as he told me the story later, he said, the day I helped rescue that baby, I knew why I was put on this earth. And he became a minister for the rest of his life. I could tell you stories like that infinitely, but we're running out of time. I know I'm over time. So anyway, the general's saying, okay, get those other internees on the road to march up there to where they can link up with the force coming across the river. Major Burgess didn't know what was happening up there across the river. He didn't realize that the attack had failed to get across. And as an artilleryman, I can tell you with no bias at all, the reason it failed is because they didn't have enough artillery support to get across the river. But anyway, Major Burgess knew that what the general was telling him didn't jibe with what was happening on the ground. So what did he do? He told his radio operator to turn off the radio. And if General Swing asked me later, I'll just say my battery failed. So he's no longer listening to General Swing, and he unilaterally uses that radio that the batteries were dead on to call the lieutenant colonel in charge of the battalion, who just landed all those internees he'd saved and was rejoicing with his men. And this is an amazing act of itself. Those vehicles are hard to maintain, amphibious tractors. All 54 of his amphibious tractors made it to the lake back and forth, 2 complete trips, and not one of them failed. Now, that is maintenance for you. So this lieutenant colonel gets this, he's rejoicing with his men, we're saved, we got these people saved, the mission's over. Major Burgess calls him on the radio and says, bring your amphibious tractors back to get the rest of us. Colonel Gibbs knows that Major Burgess is in charge of him, so he loads up his Amtraks, and they back down, they come up the 2 miles, and I think they didn't actually have to go over 2 miles, they down to the beach, and loaded up the rest of the internees, and they get out. As they were leaving, the Japanese had advanced that force of 8,000. The advanced elements of that were arriving around Mayon Point, and Art Coleman of Shippensburg told me they were close enough. As we were entering the water, we could hear the Japanese officers yelling commands to their troops. They started shooting at us. I was manning a 50 caliber machine gun, and we were firing back. Now, I didn't tell you about the 75 millimeter pack howitzers. I don't know if we ever showed that slide. I think that's Colonel Gustavus and myself when he visited me in Carlisle. He was the one that coordinated all the guerrillas. And can we get to the pack 70 Colonel doing that? Okay. Go on. It's one of the amphibious tractors going across the lake. Okay, that's a Pack 75, one of the ugliest howitzers we ever made, but it did its job. They had two of them. One came in, they were on sandbags mounted inside the Amtrak so they could fire if necessary from there. They had come out and they had set up and were firing artillery rounds in each direction to keep the Japanese away. Okay. The last load of amphibious tractors is going out. The Japanese are approaching. They start shooting, including machine gun fire. One of the guys commanding goes, Howitzer says, let's give them a taste of their own medicine. So they put in a round and they fired. Those amphibious tractors were so overloaded that they had about that much leeway in the gunwales on each side. And when that Pac 75 fired, it shook the boat so much that water splashed over the side. And the gunner of the 50 caliber machine gun pulled out his 45 and he said, the next man that puts a round in that howitzer gets shot. If that Amtrak had sunk, the others were too loaded to empty, and they would have all that would have been the end of them. So we came that close to the people getting out of there safely, and the Japanese shooting at them. Okay, I think it's time for me to end my story, but I think I've identified enough heroes for you, and I would like to end up with a few remarks. First of all, I've named a lot of heroes tonight. As far as I'm concerned, every man that volunteered to go and jump was a hero. The people that sought their lives. Now, I haven't covered one subject, which is the World War statistics. Can we get to the POW statistics? Okay, the POW statistics? Oh, there, okay. Look at that. U.S. POWs held by the Nazis versus U.S. held by the Japanese military. Look at the comparison of the World War POW statistics for civilians. Okay, I think that speaks for itself. Now, war crimes. I don't want to be anti-Japanese tonight, but facts are facts. World War II Japanese war crimes. There are so many books written about those war crimes, I couldn't possibly read them all. I kept looking in there, and sure enough, the one I was looking for the most, he was executed. But starting out with December 1937, over 300,000 Chinese died there in 1937. I told you about 20,000 being raped the first month alone. Okay? Between 1937 and 1945, the Japanese can be accounted for over 30 million civilians were killed in the Japanese areas that they occupied. In the Philippines, I did not realize just how bad it was. I saw what happened in Manila. But as the Japanese came down towards Manila, as they would go through Filipino villages, they would grab young women and make them go along as what they called comfort women. In other words, forcible sex with the soldiers. And well, they get the new, okay, we can let this one be discarded, grab another one in this village. And it was horrible to read of this. It wasn't just isolated units, it was deliberate. All the units, all the Japanese military units were doing this. Most of them were veterans of fighting in China. Most of them probably figured they'd never live to see their families at the end of the war anyway, so why not do what they could while they could. So at least one of every 20 Filipinos suffered killed by the Japanese during World War II. So the war crimes trials afterwards, look at those. 984 condemned to death, 920 of those were executed, the life sentences, and the ones that were brought to trial included the captain of the Oyoko Maru because he proved that he had absolutely no control over the military that were stuck down in his holes. He was only responsible for the wounded and the civilians up above, so they acquitted him. But of those who were executed, they include 3 people I'm really interested in. First, the major who was in charge of the ones that were loaded in the Oyoko Maru. Second, the one who was in charge of the Brazil Maru, the one that my father was carried off of unconscious. And the third one, Lieutenant Kenichi. He was captured. It's too long a story for me to tell, but it's interesting. I did not know that at the time that the only surviving guard in our camp was the interpreter, who was shown to be sympathetic to us. And he actually testified in the trial of Lieutenant Kenichi, saying, None of us liked him. We were afraid of him, and we thought what he was doing was wrong. And so one of these authors of one of these books claims that the wrong Konichi was executed. Baloney. No, it was the Lieutenant Kenichi who committed all these atrocities in both San Tomas and. By the way, not only was Kenichi responsible for what happened in our camp, but since he survived escaping down that side of the ravine, he came back the next day with the Japanese in force. They went into the town of Los Baños, and against the advice of the Filipino guerrilla who had told him, you better clear out, we're not here to stay, and the Japanese are going to come back. Against his advice, most of the Filipinos stayed there. When they saw the Japanese coming in, they fled to the church. The church was packed, full of civilians that lived there. The Japanese executed everybody they found outside. Then they set fire to the church, and they killed everybody that tried to escape. So over 1,000 Filipinos gave up their lives as a result of helping us. Okay. Can we show a picture of the nurses? I can't say enough about those nurses. 9 valiant women. They were rescued. They've been fed for a couple of weeks at least now. By the time that picture is taken away, General Wainwright was a POW all during World War II after surrendering, and he was asked, "Would you recommend? We are thinking about awarding the Bronze Star to all these nurses. Would you go along with that?" You know what General Wainwright said? No, they were just doing their duty. I'm happy to say that a few years later, Congress overruled him. All of those nurses, Army and Navy, did receive the Bronze Star, and I think probably General Wainwright lives to regret his decision. So I think I have spoken for way too long. Iwo Jima, we had 2 war correspondents that accompanied the amphibious tractors. They all thought that their headlines were going to make all the big newspapers the next day. February 23rd, greatest of parade in American military history, a big success, Los Baños. No, what the headlines were, some Marines raised a flag on Iwo Jima. And I have to agree, that symbol of bravery and patriotism of that flag going up was more important than the wonderful, brave soldiers that rescued us at Los Baños. It was more unifying the entire nation behind that patriotic symbol. A few years later, I'm a student at the Army Commanding General Staff College. I did a staff study of the raid, and a copy of that was sent to the Chief of Military History. On the basis of that, they selected me to be the technical advisor to the artist that did this painting illustrating the rescue of Los Baños as part of a series called Allied Cooperation During the War, from the French fighting, helping us at the American Revolution to then. And I think that's still available through the government printing office. You can see a copy of it down there. Okay, I've got 2 more things I want to say. First of all, I talked about General Douglas MacArthur arriving in the Philippines as his father is leaving. He's comparing the results that the Army has received with its hard-fisted approach towards the Filipinos with Taft's treatment of the Filipinos and the results. And I think that probably General MacArthur, with all the controversy about what he did in World War II, whether he was a great general or not, I think history will make the greatest legacy of General Douglas MacArthur is what he learned from comparing the results of the military effort in the Philippines with the nation-building efforts of Taft, and that's why he became a benevolent dictator in charge of the Japanese occupation. And with that, I will say mabuhay, and I hope you have a good evening. Oh, excuse me. Oh, that is the person who stole the general's refrigerator. Hank Burgess. Hank Burgess had become a state senator and a respected lawyer, and the general comes to speak in his town. Burgess goes up and introduces himself afterwards and says, I understand you lost something in the Guinea. And General Willoughby looks at him, his eyes narrow, and he says, I suspect I'm about to find out who stole it. Hank Burgess, now the president of the 11th Airborne Association, says, yes, I was me. I was picking up a load of supplies for the 11th Airborne Division. I spotted that refrigerator over there, and I decided General Swing needed it more than you did. General Willoughby looks at him, thinks about it for a minute, and he said, it was worth losing a refrigerator to have the gallant 11th Airborne Division on our side. Mabuhay. Thank you. Thank you.
So there's a YouTube movie playing right now, and you
I
said
forgot
this is
you
about
moved
6
on
minutes
around.
long. You can look it up on YouTube. But I think we ran a little bit long, so we're going to hold off on questions. But I do want to invite Chris up for the presentation to the speaker.
And you're
for
welcome to look at
joining
what
us
I've got down
tonight.
here, too.
And I also want to mention two things. There's someone called us from Florida, and their dad was in Los Baños with you. And so they're watching online, and we're going to connect you afterwards. And there's also someone here tonight whose friend's uncle was in Los Baños as well. So we have a little bit of more reunions to do after this, but we really want to thank you for the presentation. And Chris, will you do the honors of presenting the gift?
Thank you, Jeff. We'll be brief here. Is my working? Am I connected? Blue mic? Fine. We can hear you. Okay.
Go ahead, you got it turned off up there, go ahead.
Okay. Hi. So we'll try to be somewhat brief here at this point. So let me give the speaker gift to our speaker, and then I'll have a few remarks.
Well, I didn't hear the question.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank
Nice
you.
to meet you the other month. and
Oh, thank you. Was
coffee
there a
mug
question?
for you
I
to
didn't
enjoy.
hear it, but there was.
So we are our world famous coffee mug for Dave. I had the pleasure to meet Dave about a couple months ago. He was here to see how everything worked and everything at one of our meetings, and so I'm happy to have him here for a nice presentation tonight. Very detailed, very knowledgeable. Yeah, he was a full colonel in the Army as he grew up and commanded artillery, so he had a distinguished career. He has a son who was a major general in the Army as well. We want to thank Dave for his presentation, and also he has many family members here tonight. We want to thank them as well. And also I want to say a special thank you tonight to Laura Pasquello. She was years on the Roundtable board, and she also, off the board, she helped us a lot with, especially the last few years, with the press and our press releases and media publicity, and also bringing the cookies. Don't forget those as well. But she's moving on to different things now, thinking about a future home to settle in a different state, and they're making plans. And so we wish her well, and Cliff, and Cliff's still with us, but doing things on the board. But Laura is as of December 31st, her tasks are being transitioned elsewhere. So we want to thank Laura again, and also just to reiterate what Jeff said, our Kevin Heimel is our speaker for next month on Patton. And in March, Ed Cottrell, we have some generous donors step forward to pay for his travels to North Carolina to us. All expenses paid by some donors to speak for us about his P-47 experiences as a pilot World War II, European theater. Now, if you'd be so kind as to visit our helmet committee on the way out, we would appreciate it. We have the gentleman still there in the back with the World War II helmets. And other than that, we'll say goodnight. I know it's been a longer evening than some recent ones, but we learned a lot tonight. I know that. I know I did as well. And so thank you guys. You make it happen. Happy holidays. I'm glad you had, hopefully had a good happy holidays. And we'll see you next time, February 6th. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.